There is a small stream just to the, to the north of here, about a mile from here, called Majors Creek. And it played a major part in my life. We fished in it and we swam in it, and it was the family's recreation. And nearly every night in the summertime, my parents drove to Majors Creek for us to take our baths and to just enjoy the sandy bank, especially if it were moonlight. We would stay there until after dark. My mother would pack our supper, and I can just remember the many pineapple sandwiches that we consumed on the bank of Majors Creek at night as a family. My father would come in from work and gather up the family, and we would make for Majors Creek for our baths and for our supper. My mother would have it packed in a basket. We would be joined there by other people from the area, and there would be perhaps a dozen people around the picnic spread, and all the kids of the neighborhood. And I'm speaking of very nearly every night of every afternoon of the week. Of course, we kids spent the days up and down that creek fishing. The great bait that we used were grasshoppers. There were plenty of them in those days. And we had rubber guns that we constructed either as pistols or rifles, and we used old inner tubes to make rubber bands. We would tie together and use the knot, which we would slip behind a notch, and we could aim that thing at that grasshopper, flip that notch up, then the rubber band would go out and hit the grasshopper and stun him long enough for us to go pick him up, put him in a Coca-Cola bottle. Then, of course, the Coca-Cola bottle would go in our back pocket, and the next day we would go to Majors Creek, and every time we dropped one of those grasshoppers in one of those black holes, we got some kind of a fish out of that. That was great sport, and we knew that creek from one end of. I could, at this moment, do 3 miles of that creek in my mind, and every bend and every shallow and deep spot in it. The winters were hunting of one kind or another. Songbirds when we were young, and squirrels when we got a little bit older. And that's about as far as we ever went with squirrels. There were no deer in those days, and no turkeys. There was no turkey hunting around this part, but hunting of some kind, mostly squirrels. And at night, every Saturday night we went possum hunting. There were almost no coons in those days. It was a very rare thing for a raccoon to be around, but there were plenty of possums. And all the neighborhood kids would gather, and we'd take a lantern and go out, and then the next day that'd be on Friday night, and all the Saturday morning we skinned them and stretched them for a week, and then the next Saturday we met the hide buyer up at the local store, and he bought our possum hides for about 20 to 25 cents a piece, depending on the quality and the size of them. That was how we made our spending money. Possum hunting. It was a rare thing we found a coon. Reading played a big part in my early life, but it was hard for me to find anything to read. I think I mentioned earlier that I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's and grandfather's house. My grandfather was an avid reader of what we call Western stories in those days. And they would be brought to him from Mobile by his sons when they came to visit him. And my grandmother's house was filled with these Western story magazines. My mother was totally opposed to any such idea that she regarded as trash that I was getting down there, but she tolerated it. She did look the other way. But I found it to be wonderful reading material, and I found out in my later life it was good literature, because much of those Western stories were written by famous writers who wrote under other names. People that were big in the literary world wrote those short stories, and it was good reading, and I learned a lot from it. I became an avid reader of the Rover Boy series. There were about, probably 30 of the Rover Boy books. The Rover Boys at sea, and the Rover Boys in the air, and the Rover Boys here and there. Every time my father made a business trip to Mobile, which was about every other week, he had to bring me a Rover Boy book. And I would stay up all night if the family would let me, and reading, and I would read them over and over and over again. I kept those things until I was myself teaching, and I interested other kids in reading. I remember giving those books away to kids in my class for their reading purposes. But my grandmother's house was my library. A gentleman by the name of Davis lived at Dixie Landing, and he gave me the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe, and he did it at an age when it was very difficult for me to read those books. There were so many words in Edgar Allan Poe's prose that I did not know. So, but it was an education to me. He had so many French words in it, and I was so intrigued over the French words that he used that it influenced me to take French in high school. Had a couple of years. But reading was my life. I don't remember the time when I couldn't read. By the time I was in the first grade, I knew for the first grade reader by heart. I could repeat it today. The little red hen found a seed. It was a wheat seed. The little red hen said, "Who will plant the seed?" "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the dog. "Not I," said the horse. And the fox was always in there, and the goose. But when she got to the end of it, the little red hen would always say, "I will then," and she did. And then after the seed got planted, it was who's going to water it. And all these other animals, one by one, that turned the job down, but the little red hen said, "I will," and she did. And they went through the whole process till finally we reaped the wheat, and we ground the wheat, and finally we cooked the wheat. And the little red hen said, "Who will eat the bread?" And then each one of these animals came up, and each one of them volunteered. "Yeah, I," said the cat. "I," said the fox. But the little red hen said, "I will," and she did. The biggest thing in our lives in those days was when the water came. There was always a raft of logs that had to be gotten out by my father. And he always had a limited time to do it. And the rainy season generally came in the dead of winter. And if the water came before Christmas and the raft of logs could be sold, there was money for Christmas. If not, there was not much Christmas around this house. There'd be a Christmas tree, but there would be an envelope on it that says there'll be an air rifle when the water comes. When the water came, we all got some school clothes. My mama generally bought a dish or two. That chair you're sitting in was the result of when the water came a certain year, and she bought some chairs, some Sears Roebuck. And they were shipped to Bay Minette by freight on the railroad, and my dad went down there on his old log truck back in the 30s, and I remember seeing those 6 of those chairs piled up on the back of the log truck when after the water comes. And that was just not for my family, that was for everybody in this part of the country. It was the biggest part of the year, was the coming of the high water. If you prepared for it for months in advance. The black community looked to it because it was employment in the dead of winter. And those who could ride a log drew twice the wages of those who sawed the logs down and cut them up, because there was an art to floating those logs out. It was time to make some big money. You got probably $3 a day for floating, pushing the ice out of the way and getting on that log and riding it out with a spike pole, pushing and pulling. That log had to be kept twirling at all times to bore its way out of the bushes. You kept that log rolling. If you didn't, you couldn't push it through. It had to bore its way through the bushes to get it out into open water. There was an art to it, and those that were qualified as watermen were looked up to by all the rest of the community, black and white. He's a waterman. He's a waterman, you know. They were almost as much as doctors were. Doctors were worshipped in those days. Doctors, automobile mechanics, who really knew how to fix an automobile, were regarded as highly in the community as the physicians. And the waterman. He's a waterman, you know. Immediately after all of the longleaf pine was cut, and before the woods grew up thickly, quail hunting was the sport of everybody in the country. Every man, my father had his favorite bird dog, and that was his favorite sport in this world. They rode horses in those days and covered miles and miles of territory and would come back with dozens and dozens of birds. I've heard my father describe the air as just being so full of feathers that when there would be 4 or 5 people shooting into those big covers of quail. And we're talking about 20 miles in each direction here. The woods were open, and everybody hunted everywhere. The hunting woods were as open as the woods were to animals. But by the time I grew up, the woods were too thick, the quail were gone, and although I went quail hunting a very few times in my life, it was no longer the sport. And there were no deer, almost none. There's a picture hanging on the wall right here of my grandfather and me with guns in our hands and 3 deer. I remember that I had gone to my grandmother's house there, and when I got back, my other grandfather was sitting on the front porch in the most excited state I have ever seen him. Come on, Les, I've been waiting for you. They've killed some deer, and they're up at Peyton's store up here. Come on, son, let's go. Let's go see those deer. Well, we walked up there and they had killed 3 deer. And this is in a time when if you saw a deer track in the swamp, it was the talk of the country. But killing 3 at one time, nobody had ever heard it. That hadn't been done in a century in this part of the country, and wasn't done for 50 years afterwards either. How and why, who killed the deer, I don't know. But somebody shoved a gun in each of our hands, and there it is, right there. And I could have told the story differently, because there I am by the deer with that gun in my hand, and my other grandpa with a shotgun in his. We could have told that story differently. There were small animals around, lots of squirrels and lots of possums, but coons had been hunted to extinction because the hides were so valuable. When a possum hide was worth 25 cents, a coon hide would be worth $4. My father scouted, being a logging man, he scouted the swamp for coon sign, and my father's brother, Uncle Arthur Browse, did the shooting of them, and the 2 of them would go off together at night into the areas that my father had scouted in his business during the day. And my father would paddle the boat, and my uncle would sit in the front of the boat with his carbide light on and shoot the coons out of the overhanging trees over the water. They would fill a boat with coons, and they were hunted to extinction. Remember one time they killed a wildcat, and it was the dead of winter, and they brought that wildcat home and propped it up out here as if it were alive, and by the next morning it was frozen stiff, and rigor mortis too, of course. And for the next 2 or 3 days I hauled that wildcat around in my little red coaster wagon to all of the neighbors' houses to show him off. I think we even took him to school. My father caught a bunch of little wildcats too. In the logging wood, he had a wonderful story that he told about it. One of his workers was cutting timber right close to him. His name was Clipper, and he called him Clip. And my dad walked up and found this little nest of wildcats. And he said, "Oh, Clip." "Yes, sir." "Come help me. I caught some wildcats. I got some wildcats I want you to help me." "Yes, sir." This went on 3 or 4 times. "Yes, sir." "Clip, are you coming?" "No, sir." My father then said he took off a leather jacket that he had, and he made a dive into this little nest of wildcats. And he said it was at that point he discovered that they didn't have the eyes open yet. And they said "Pip, pip, pip" at him. And that was the extent of their resistance. Well, anyway, he wrapped up these 3 wildcats and brought them home here. And my mother raised them with an eyedropper with milk. And she would have to wrap the little cat up in a blanket to keep him from clawing her hands when she'd hold him and feed him, because he wanted to use his hands to nurse with, but she had to do that. Well, anyway, she raised those 3 cats. They got to be, well, one of them didn't quite make it. My grandpa sat on him in a chair out here in the back porch, and they revived him in a tub of water that happened to be there. But he went into a decline and died within a few days after that. But the other 2 reached, they grew up, and they would lie out here on top of, we had a smokehouse out in the backyard out here, and those cats would get up in there on a winter day in the sun. They would lie stretched out across the top of that, or they would get on a limb in a little tree out in the backyard and drape themselves over a limb and lie there with all 4 feet hanging down. My brother came along about that time, and my mother was afraid to have the wildcats here with a baby. So she persuaded her brother 3 miles down the road to take the 2 grown cats. And one night, something got after his chickens, and he ran out to see what it was, and he grabbed a picket off of his fence, and he opened his chicken house door, and something came out of it, and he whammed it, and he killed one of those wildcats, which he hated very much. He didn't realize that was what he was doing. He had a brother-in-law who lived in Mobile, and he persuaded them that since he couldn't keep them there on account of his chickens, he persuaded this brother-in-law to take that wildcat to Mobile. And the wildcat got to leaving home and roaming a bit, but he'd always come back. And one day, there was a piece in the Mobile Register about the Mobile police shooting a wildcat off of the top of a building on Government Street down about the waterfront. And the pet wildcat never came back. So we know where that wildcat came from. There's a bear story too in my mother's family. She had a brother Thomas whose job it was to look after the family herd of cows that would be kept in the swamp. And he found a little bear up a tree, and a very small thing, and he too wrapped him up in his coat and took him home. This was before I was born, when my mother was growing up. And this little bear grew up in their home. But he began to get to be a problem as he grew older. He would get in the middle of the bed, and when somebody wanted to run him out of the bed, he'd turn ugly. But so they finally decided they had to get rid of him. And there was a trader, there were peddlers that came through regularly in those days, and they gave this bear to this peddler, and he took him and used him to train him to do a few tricks, and he started making a living with him. And there is a record that does the name Connie Baggett mean anything to you right now? Connie Baggett, about 10 years ago, wrote a series of stories about a guy who had a bear, and she traces him to Daphne, and then she traces him over around up through Mobile and Washington County through newspaper accounts, and then they trace him to Purdue Hill, and then they trace him to a little community in Monroe County where this bear kills his owner. And in the Mobile Register, they have a picture of this man's grave, and we know where that bear came from too. I can tell you about Mr. Cahaley. He walked and carried his pack on his back as late as 1930, maybe 28 or 29, but I think maybe as late as 1930. And he would come in and unroll that pack on our front porch, which was open in those days. I've closed it in now, and roll that pack back, and he would have all manner of trade items in there. My mother always bought needles and sewing thread from him, and maybe a sewing tape and buttons. She would always buy something from him. And then he had a regular route that would take him into Monroe County and back to Bay Minette. In later years, his daughter, in memory of my mother being a good customer, always sent her a Christmas present of some kind. she continued the store in Baymonette as long as it was in operation. She'd send my mother a pair of slippers, a handkerchief, or something for Christmas in memory of being a good customer of her father's. During the mid-1930s, we had a rolling store that passed through here, and always made a stop, and we bought items like sugar and potatoes. We always bought kerosene, and they would take chickens in trade. They had cages on there to put the chickens in, and my mother sometimes had chickens to trade, but mostly it was 25 cents worth of this, maybe 50, maybe the whole shopping trip would be worth 50 cents. Well, my cousin Davis and I were very close together when we were about high school age, and he lived for a short time in my grandmother's house after my grandmother was gone, and one of our projects was building a telegraph. Our local science book had a diagram of how to build a telegraph. It involved a big nail for an iron core and a lot of copper wire wrapped around it for a magnet, and a piece of metal bent in an odd sort of a shape so that it would be attracted to the top of the iron core, and a little key down here, so when you mashed it down, it would tap. And we would use one tap for a dot and two taps for a dash. And we constructed a telegraph line from my house, in my bedroom, across this field out here in front of the house, down to his house, which is a quarter of a mile away. And we put up poles, and we took glass bottles and broke the bottoms out of them and stuck them on the top of the poles for insulators. And we got up our wire, it was copper wire, out of old automobile generators. And we finally rigged us up a line, and then our problem was getting enough batteries involved and we never did find enough batteries to make the thing operate properly. But he figured out that if he hooked a Model T coil to his end of it and attracted my attention, made that coil buzz, that I would touch my coil and I would get shocked. And he did, and I went back over the bed, and I have never forgiven him to this day. The homes of the swamp dwellers were generally one-room affairs. And the one that I can remember in particular had 3 of its posts were living trees. And he had found 3 trees that were in the right position, and he had set a 4th post and had built a one-room shack. It was covered with partly some sheets of used metal, rusty, and partly with some split white oak shakes that were about 6 feet long and maybe a foot wide. There was a rusty stovepipe sticking out of one side of it. I guess he used that at some point in the year for heat in the building as well as for cooking. But he had another old iron stove leaning against a tree where he did his cooking. Some of them were pretty good houses. One in particular I remember was a 2-room house built out of sawed boards, but it was a white employer who had built the house and allowed the swamp dweller to live in it and farm from my dad's property. And some of them were pretty well equipped. I remember one who had a boat with an automobile engine in it, Model T engine. But he used it to come and go to the piney woods to see his kinfolks and to trade his goods. He was a real fisherman. They had been slaves on those plantations. That was their home. They had learned how to live in the swamp. They had no responsibilities. Nobody bothered them. They could get all the food that they wanted, and they could find enough in there to trade for what they absolutely had to have in the way of clothing and what few medicines they had to have, and what few groceries that they couldn't trade for from the passing tugboats. Of course, nowadays they couldn't do that because there are no passing tugboats anymore. But they always had catfish to trade, and that was a sought after commodity along the river on the tugboats. But they were willing to trade sugar and coffee for catfish. There were at least a dozen of these families that were still living on those old plantations as late as World War II. But World War II brought them out, mainly because there was opportunity outside. There was work where there had not been before. And of course, there were obligations to serve in the military. But it was World War II that brought them out. At the midpoint of my professional life, I was able to come back to my ancestral home and live in it, and have lived here the remainder of my life and during 25 years of retirement. And it has been a privilege to. They say you can't go home, but I did.